Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, May 15th, and we will hear the presentation Focus on Micromobility, Incorporating New Methods of Travel into the Planning Landscape. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel. And for your content questions related to today's presentation, again, just type those in that box, your chat box located in the webinar toolbar. We will answer those questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up on your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2020. So thanks to all those APA chapters and divisions for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today's session is sponsored by the Transportation Planning Division, which we'll hear a little bit more in a second, but thanks to them for getting all this together today. We are excited for this presentation. Next up on your screen is actually a screenshot of our webcast webpage. If you head over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcast, you'll see our upcoming webcasts. That's where our schedule is. That's where you can register for all of our webcasts. We're actually booked through the end of October. So we're just getting more information together, and then we'll have those registrations available. Like I said, this is a screenshot of our webcast webpage. So you can see up at the top, there's different tabs. If you click on the prior webcast tabs, you'll be able to download PDF versions of all of our previous webcast presentations. And we do offer distance education. We have 3 sessions available for on-demand viewing through the end of the year, each worth 1.5 CM credits. One of them is actually worth ethics, the other one law, and the third just regular credit. So if you click on that tab, you can get more information on how you can get those. Let's see here. Today's session is available for 1.5 CM credits. To log those credits, head over to planning.org, log into your MyAPA account, and then you can search either by today's title or event number. And if you don't get a chance to write those down, you can always find them on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. And make sure you like us on Facebook. Just search Planning Webcast on Facebook, and that's where we post any up-to-date information on either cancellations or new editions of our webcast. And be sure to head over to YouTube and just search Planning Webcast. We'll pop up our YouTube channel. Make sure that you subscribe to our channel to get updated notifications. We post all of our recorded sessions there, including this one, which we'll post as well. We have over 300 videos, almost 3,000 subscribers, so make sure that you join us. And I think that's the end of my housekeeping items. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Brian Laverty, who will kick us off and talk a little bit about the Transportation Planning Division. Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. As I said, I'm Brian Laverty. I'm a transportation planner with Mead and Hunt, and I'm also the programs vice chair for the Transportation Planning Division. And so it's my pleasure to host some of these webinars. And I want to, just on behalf of the division, first of all, thank our 3 presenters who are speaking today. Michael Schwartz from Ride Report, Alvaro Villagran, and Po Sun from Sam Schwartz. And I did want to also thank the APA Ohio chapter for not only hosting this webinar, but for hosting a number of TPD sponsored webinars in the past, as Christine mentioned. And I did want to make a few quick plugs about Transportation Planning Division related things. First off, our website, you can see right there on the screen. It's easy to remember. It's just transportation.planning.org. Our YouTube channel, if you don't download the slides and copy that link right there, it's really easy. On YouTube or any other social media, you can just search for APA TPD and you'll find us. YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc. And then also I wanted to mention that the State of Transportation Planning, which is the signature publication of our division, which we put out every 2 years, has recently been published. And there's a link right there. You can find it just by going to our webpage, transportation.planning.org, and clicking through into the Knowledge Center portion of the webpage. Right now, it's only free to view for TPD members, so there's a little incentive to join the division if you aren't already. And with that, I will pass off to our first of 3 presenters, Michael Schwartz. Michael?
And Michael, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Chris. I was going to forget that. Thank you very much, Brian and Chris, for that introduction. And I'm really excited to be here, everybody. Thank you for taking time to join us. As Brian said, my name is Michael Schwartz. I'm the head of customers and policy for Ride Report. For those of you who aren't familiar with our company, we help cities launch, manage, and evaluate their micromobility program with sort of our core set of tools as a set of software tools to help support micromobility programs. My role as the head of customers and policy is to help cities think through legislation and rules that can help them achieve the outcomes they want from their programs. And my background is I was a transportation planner by training and public health as well. I worked for the city of San Francisco for almost 10 years and have done a lot of things around new mobility. So this is kind of a familiar area for me. And throughout this slide deck, I just want to also say that we ran a webinar series, and I will show the link on my last slide, my.ridereport.com/blog. And some of the slides I have blatantly stolen from that webinar series. I learned a ton over that time period. And if on any of these topics people want to dive deeper, you can head over there at some other point in time. So I'm going to hide my video now and just work on my screens. Oh, I actually didn't even share my video. I'm going to do it real quick just so you can see me. Hello, everybody. I'm going to hide again so I can present, but at least now you have a face behind these slides. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just set the framing, micromobility leading up to coronavirus. I think many of you who are following trends in the news or perhaps in your own cities, you may know that there were just a number of operators. This phenomenon kind of took off like wildfire, starting really with dockless bike share in China, and then Bird launching in Santa Monica just about 2.5 years ago. And then there was just a whole rush of sort of venture capital money and a lot of different operators. And in large part in reaction to the launch of Uber and Lyft and TNCs really kind of quote unquote disrupting cities. There's been a lot of mixed reaction to micromobility. People really, really love it. Some people really, really don't love it. And it's a little bit politically charged. So it ends up landing on elected officials' desks in the news cycle. And so sometimes things get away from sort of policy objectives and are a little more reactionary in nature. One of the things that has happened because of that, cities really wanting to show that they are in control and be in control of this phenomenon have had some pretty interesting and experimental regulation. And it's been a real focus to show that they are really managing this program well, trying to help it achieve the outcomes they're looking for. So just a little more detail on each of those. This is a report that came out not that long ago from actually a venture capital company, just showing the sheer number of companies in the micromobility space. A little zoom in on just scooters is really, this is kind of the top half of that chart. And you can just see how many different operators there are. And it's easy to get confused by them. And in your own city, you may have a number as well. And sort of drilling down on that, again, that sort of polarizing piece of it, you can see there's just been a lot of news articles all over the place, people taking sort of extreme positions about these are the greatest thing to ever happen to cities and these things are gonna come and kill all of our children, and everything in between. But it's definitely gotten a lot of news, and so there's been a real push to figure out how to manage these programs well. I want to make sure to credit Jonathan Hopkins of Lime. That's where this slide comes from, again, from one of our webinar series. It's a very complicated slide, but if you just look in the 2 red circles, I think that's the sort of main place to focus which is really about scooters and shared micromobility has been singled out a little bit versus similar modes, both in terms of fees that they need to pay, often in terms of large upfront costs, so maybe an application fee, perhaps a fee to launch. Sometimes they're as they go, but it's definitely, I think, particularly because it was a venture capital backed phenomenon, the idea that you should pay for this as opposed to it being free or subsidized. And similarly, cities very astutely said, well, we don't want this to just be in certain areas. We want to make sure all underserved areas have access to it, people who might not have access to smartphones, people who are unbanked, typical things that have been part of docked bike share that I think we're likely to hear about in the two later presentations. So that does, in this model, it can cost people a little bit in terms of equity costs. Oh, hold on one moment.
This is life in the age of Corona.
Hi, everyone. My apologies. That was just my 3-year-old daughter coming in. Let me just pick up where I was here. Scooters, in terms of being below that blue line, are certainly an area of transportation that are seen generally as being better for traffic conditions and air quality, and in some ways, sort of how the cities view their fees and how they impose that may not be exactly in line with things like cars and TNCs that actually pay less in terms of fees on a per mile basis. And certainly cars, we know, can have an outsized impact on things like road safety. So this sort of combination of factors led up to this idea of what we internally call micromobility winter, which is the idea that the sort of good times of a lot of free-flowing venture capital money may be coming to an end, and that with this many operators and this much competition, in combination with sort of very challenging regulations and fees to make a sustainable operation, may mean that a number of scooter companies could end up consolidating. Some may end up not being in business. And with coronavirus, that just kind of accelerated that phenomenon. So we call it micromobility winter on steroids. So obviously it's a very tough time given some of the uncertainty in the market. We know that some operators may not make it through this time. And certainly some cities, particularly ones that may not be as profitable, will either lose micromobility or may need to find a different ways to help fund it. And we think we're going to see that phenomenon happening in this post-coronavirus era. So maybe many of you read the big headline last week. Is kind of we see as a very loud shot across the bow, where Lime, as part of its fundraising round, received a huge investment from Uber. And as part of that investment, they also devolved all of their jump operations, which is their e-bike and scooter operations, now making Lime into the largest micromobility operator in the world and removing one of their largest competitors. So this kind of consolidation, I think, is just going to be the first of a number of consolidations or perhaps bankruptcies from these companies. And so the landscape is really going to change where those first slides with all those different companies will probably look very different about a year from now. So let's talk a little bit about the current state of things. We know there's no surprise to people on this call that obviously all travel has gone way down. A couple of numbers I just want to particularly make sure you can take a closer look at here. This transit number, negative almost 70% down, is kind of an incredible number. And we know that's for a number of reasons. First of all, people maybe not feeling as comfortable getting on transit vehicles due to social distancing. And also, of course, transit service levels are being cut with the economic recession and the challenge of actually finding operators to drive at the same levels. And it's going to be a very long road back. Obviously, with the recession, funding will stay down for a long time. And so that is something that is important to mark. Think about a topic for a different webinar, but how we can save transit and make sure it can continue to stay robust. But I think we also, for this webinar, really need to talk about how to respond in such a way to allow people to still maintain their mobility without that same level of transit. The other number in there is the driving. So when this chart first was presented a few weeks ago, it was more like -35, -40%. You can see it got as low as down 65%. But it's really coming back very quickly. And I think that's no surprise to people who know how driving works. As people go back to work, people don't want to be on transit or aren't taking transit as much, that a lot of them are going to start driving. And you can imagine what might happen to our roads. You can see not that many days ago, we almost got back to baseline. If in a few more weeks we're actually above baseline, we know that our roads are at capacity. And so we really need to think about different ways for people to get around. So that doesn't say anything about bikes and scooters. That Apple doesn't track that data, unfortunately, although I'm sure they will start. But I think that anecdotally, most people know that we're in a little bit of a biking boom. A lot of people, particularly when they're staying at home, shelter in place, are discovering bikes again for the first time in a long time. The streets have much less traffic, so people feel safer riding their bikes. And an example of this is Van Moof, an e-bike company, just this week announced that they raised an enormous amount of money based on really high sales this spring of e-bikes. And so there is this kind of small inkling of a sign that there could be a shift going on here of people choosing to move towards more, these types of modes of transportation. In terms of shared micromobility trends, we've seen a pretty large drop in all around. So this is data that we have in aggregate across a number, many markets and many operators. You can see that February versus April, all 90+% drop in the number of vehicles for rent, the number of trips taken, and we're talking about millions and millions of trips here. And then even the trips per vehicle per day. So for the vehicles that are still on the street, the number of trips being taken are way down. And you can see that it is starting to just come back a little bit. And I think sort of as we move into the next phase of coronavirus, I think that shared micromobility will be part of that next phase of opening up. And we're seeing operators start to launch again in cities. And I think we'll continue to see trips going up as well with that. That line chart that you're seeing there, that's the number of available vehicles across markets. And so in terms of the profile of the trips, this is another trend that we saw. You can see that most micromobility trips tended to be pretty short, replacing sort of short transit, maybe long walking trips or TNC trips, somewhere between 1.5 miles and 2 miles. One of the big changes in the profile is that we're seeing a very large increase in long trips, so that greater than 5 miles, and you can see even the ones over at the end. So obviously on the scale, the bottom chart is way down in terms of the total numbers, but in terms of the distribution of the trips, people are taking shared scooters, shared e-bikes, shared bikes for longer trips, for leisure and transportation. And that makes sense given obviously what people have been up to for the last couple of months and what their use case might be for shared micromobility. Other trends we've seen is that operators are adapting to this time. So you can see here's an example. Spin has an Everyday Heroes program where they're allowing people who have essential jobs access to the vehicles at a discounted rate, and in many cases free. And they have a whole new set of cleaning processes. There's an operator in New Zealand called Flamingo, who New Zealand has just sort of just started allowing food delivery. It's a little different than in the United States. They actually had no food delivery for the first phase, and now they are. And one of their scooter companies started a scooter food delivery service on top of that. And you can see that that's just something that they think will be more useful during this time period. Another person who we had on one of our webinars is the CEO of a company called Pony, who's based in France. And they adapted their whole business model to really focus on longer term rentals. So rather than have it be spontaneous bike share rentals, they were allowing people to use them for the week and the month. And they found actually a lot of success and a lot of demand for that as people, particularly in the most significant phases of coronavirus, didn't want to have sort of a more frequently shared model. And I think the real story that, again, I think a lot of the attendees are following is this huge change from public agencies in terms of just really nimble approaches and agile of changing streets in a very short amount of time. So the idea of closing down streets, taking lanes for bikes is something that is, a many months, usually years long process and is happening in a matter of days and weeks. So Oakland is kind of the most prominent example, where they have 10% of their streets closed to through traffic as part of a slow streets program. Just at the end of last week, the UK announced that they will be putting $2 billion towards enhancing their pedestrian and bicycle networks. And as part of that, they're going to legalize e-scooters. They're one of the last countries in the world where even privately owned e-scooters are not legal. So you can see that there's going to be some pretty big changes there. And then we're already starting to see Seattle being the first people saying, you know what, we like the way this is and we're not going to change it back. And so they're actually permanently closing some of the streets where they're using these temporary features at the moment. So wrapping up to move forward here, some things to think about. And I'm going to give a lot of credit here to one of our partners, Jacob Sherman at the Portland Bureau of Transportation, for a lot of these ideas. That, you know, we know that they're coming out of coronavirus. We still have these very ambitious goals around major problems that are, you know, on the same scale as the coronavirus, right? Climate change. And so what can we, shared micromobility, what part of that solution what part can it play? And obviously, based on the early slides, we know that, you know, startups, micromobility is probably going to be volatile for a little while, and so that's just part of the idea. That's part of the game. And as a city, you just need to be aware of that. And then obviously, coronavirus has exposed weaknesses in the system. So how can we fortify those? Because we know there will be challenges like a coronavirus that will happen again. And what can we learn? So some considerations for cities. Definitely want to view micromobility perhaps in a new light. I mentioned the reduced transit service earlier. You know, micromobility may be a stopgap to help people get from point A to point B, particularly at discounted rates, and also the economic recession. These companies may provide jobs. And so sort of moving from a full regulatory to maybe a more partnership model. So maybe the fees that you take from micromobility operators go right back into those slow streets and temporary measures, creating more trips and more fees. And it's this virtuous cycle of revenues. A lot of cities also have been focused on sort of caps, trying to eliminate the need for what I think they call scooter graveyards. But I think that particularly post-coronavirus, operators are really getting that they just want to put out the right number that are actually going to get used. So maybe benchmarks of just making sure the scooters are getting used as opposed to a hard cap. And then a final thing is there's a lot of opportunities around the data piece of micromobility, and obviously our company is very close to this, but you can actually more nimbly make updates to your program with data-driven management. So rather than run a whole trial for 9 months, evaluate it, then decide how to update it, you can actually make updates sort of on the fly, by day, by week, by month, and there's a real opportunity there. And then obviously within all that, there's just a whole list of uncertainties too. We don't know how behavior is going to change in the long run, which companies are going to survive, and again, how we can learn some lessons, as I mentioned before, for how this can help us think about other broad problems like climate change. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And again, here is that web link if you want to write it down really quick, if you want to dive in a little more deeply on anything that I just shared with you. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alvaro.
Hello, everyone.
There you go. That looks good. Oops, you had it. There you go.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me today presenting at this webinar. Happy to be here. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the future of bike share regarding integration to transit and responsive to COVID. Oh. Sorry about that. So for today's presentation, I'm going to go through a quick overview, an introduction to who I am and where I work. I'm going to talk a little bit about efforts on bike share integration to transit, some of the responses of bike share to the COVID crisis, and some of the opportunities for the future of biking and bike share. So quickly about myself, I'm Alvaro Villagran. I am program manager at the Shared Use Mobility Center. I have a master in urban planning from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I'm a member of the APA Transportation Planning Division and the Illinois and North Carolina chapters. So the Shared Use Mobility Center, for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a non-for-profit organization working in the public good. Our mission is to create a multimodal transportation system that works for all. We put transit as a backbone for this ecosystem, and we are keen to integrate different modes of transportation that provide mobility options for people that so they don't have to use their cars. We work out across the country. We partner with federal, local, state agencies, and we are very keen in producing applied research and sharing knowledge from the pilot projects that we work on different programs. And the lessons learned that we learn from these projects and the result of our research, we share it for free at our learning center. You can see here on the page and the webpage, there are learning models for different type of modes and different case studies. So I invite you all to take a look at that after this webinar. Oh my God. Sorry about that. I don't know why I keep jumping. So today I'm gonna be talking about bike share integration to transit, and it's important to think about this, in the current context, in the sense that ridership for transit has been going down, as Michael pointed out, and the bike share hasn't suffered as much of a ridership decline. In many cases, it has even going up for many systems. So bike share integration to transit becomes more relevant today, even if it has been an ongoing effort for many agencies. So the integration of bike share to transit provide an opportunity to provide a first last mile connection, increase transit ridership for sure. With that, also expanding the access to destinations, either in combination to transit service or in replacement of it when it is not available. Bike share programs have been promoting affordable and equitable access to biking and to mobility in general. Definitely help transit agencies reducing the need to accommodate bikes on their transit vehicles, buses or trains. And bike share also provides an on-demand service. So, users have more flexibility and more freedom to engage with their system whenever they need to. For today's presentation, I'm going to be referring to this TCRP report that was published a couple of years ago on public transit and bike share integration. And as you can see in this table on the right of the screen, there have been many bike share programs that have explored some form of integration with transit, but many of those options still need to be developed. And I'm going to go through some of these in the next couple of slides. So one is the geographic integration, or as we call the co-location. So placing bike share next to transit in a way that facilitates that multimodal connection. So this in this image, you can see this is the case of Minnesota. So nice ride. Minnesota started placing the stations next to the train. And now they're moving into a more sophisticated mode of integration of transit and bike share and all the modes, including scooter share, through the mobility hubs model. Other bike share programs that started kind of separately from the transit system, kind of in parallel, usually run by non-for-profit or for-profit companies, have their own branding and were perceived as a separate system. And now transit agencies have been showing more interest in incorporating them to their branding and their system, like the case of Ride KC in Kansas City. As you can see here, the difference what it was before and what it is today. Another area that is probably underdeveloped to the present, but a huge promise for the future is payment integration of bike share with transit. So LA Metro, through the Metro Bike program, has been a pioneer in this sense, where they integrated bike share to their TAP card, integrating transit and biking through the same payment platform and the same card. Other programs have used connections or passes to connect bus and bike share, but they haven't developed yet a full integration of payment modes. And that's something that we're going to be talking about in a couple of slides through the Mobility as a Service platform. Another trend where bike share programs and transit can collaborate and looking forward to expand in the future is through electrification of bike share. So bike share, as you know, as a traditional, pedal assist, pedal assist system, it imposes some limitations in terms of like the physical abilities of riders and the distance of the rides in average. That's something that Michael showed through with data in his presentation. And the incorporation of electric bikes to public bike share programs, it is a promising avenue to expand not only the length of the trip, but also the type of users that are going to be participating and using bike share programs in combination with transit. Oh, keep jumping. Sorry about that. So bike share as part of transit is looking into the future. It's a key component for the Mobility as a Service platform. So for those of you who are not familiar with Mobility as a Service, or MaaS as we also know it, the idea is that it's going to be an integrated platform where different modes of transportation will integrate both in the backend and for the user through apps. And that will allow to provide a multiplicity of services that right now are disconnected or scattered or functioning in different platforms, and the user is the one who has to go through the struggle of figuring out how to complete their trips. So Mobility as a Service will provide real data and information about the service for the customers. Another function is the multimodal trip planner. So for if you want to complete your trip using different modes, you can do it with the information that is provided to the app, and then figuring out what the different options are for you to complete your trip. The payment integration, as I mentioned before, it's a key component of the Mobility as a Service platform, allowing customers to just pay for the trips, in one single platform instead of having to carry cash and different cards and so on. As well as integrating customer service, as creating user accounts, so each individual can access to one platform, and a subscription model for payments. So the reason why this Mobility as a Service platform is even more promising in the current context is because with the impacts of COVID, people now has to, especially transit users, have seen that their usual, bus or train, it's not necessarily an option anymore because they're fearing of not feeling comfortable sharing the space, or because the schedule is changing and adapting and it's not working for their needs. So bike share programs provide a very good solution to serve those needs. And if it were already integrated with transit, that would be even easier for people to jump in and start using the bikes. So I want to talk about access to biking and how bike share programs contribute to this, and biking as an essential mode of transportation in these times of COVID. So the North America Bike Share Association put together this graphic where they're tracking different programs that are still in operation or closed during the COVID. I want to quickly mention that some of the programs that have been closed during this time, it has been for different reasons. In some cases, some bike share programs shut down for the winter time, so it's a seasonal, planned type of closure. Other bike share programs have been going through a process of restructuring the whole micromobility landscape. This is the case, for example, in Denver or in Pittsburgh. So they are also not necessarily impacted by the COVID, but part of a restructuring of the system. And other ones are closed because they are upgrading their system, either changing vendors or incorporating electric bikes to their system. Access to biking is not exclusive to bike share, as Michael was saying. There is a huge demand now for bikes in general, and I just wanted to point out that states have been responding differently in terms of how to consider bike shops as an essential service or not. And this is important again to provide access to a mode of transportation in times where public transit is affected. So for ridership increase, again, there has been a peak in demand during the coronavirus early stages. But as the graph in the lower right shows you, biking is still very sensitive to weather conditions. And that's true for bike share programs as it is for biking and walking in general. So that's always a consideration when we look at the data of ridership related to bike and bike share. Many bike share programs have provided memberships or discounted membership for essential workers, especially in the healthcare sector. Also expanding their equity programs, usually a $5 annual or monthly membership. Some cases, they just drop their single trip fare, like in the case of Livy in Chicago, and other programs decided to go completely free system-wide, the case in Detroit and Memphis, Tennessee, for example, to promote access to biking and bike share. An area that has been somehow explored but not in its full potential is the use of bike share for deliveries, and this is true not only for food deliveries and restaurants, grocery stores, but also for pharmacies, and drugs that are also essential during the coronavirus time. Another thing that bike share has proven very resilient facing this crisis is the relocation of stations to serve destinations that become essential or more important during coronavirus time, like the case of hospitals and clinics. And bike share programs have been very adamant in maintaining safety and both for the employees and for the bikes and the stations, disinfecting them and cleaning them to make sure that people feel comfortable and safe riding them during the coronavirus time. And as you know, biking and bike share have provided a great opportunity for people to use it not only for essential trips, but also for recreational purposes in a time where social distancing is critical, and it also allows people to enjoy the great quality of air that many cities are experiencing in these times with the reduction of car-oriented trips. So with that opportunity to go out and explore and reconnect with biking and bike share, there is of course opportunities for the future to make these changes more permanently. As Michael also referred to, cities like Oakland or Seattle have been incorporating some tools to open streets. Something that I would like to point out is this. It's an interesting time where many cities in the U.S., different scales, large and small towns, are looking at what other cities around the world are doing in response to coronavirus, and also getting good lessons learned from other parts of the globe to integrate into their toolbox here in the U.S. I think that this is a great consequence of coronavirus in terms of being more connected. Also want to point out that these open streets interactions and creating bike lanes quickly through tactical urbanism must also be complemented with many of the plans that have been already being developed by many planners around the country to make biking facilities and safe bike networks more available for people and in their different cities and geographies. And I just want to refer to this small town and rural multimodal network that provides good examples of how different towns in the States have been accommodating bike share biking in their areas. Bike share is not a story only for big cities. Small towns also have bike share programs, while in different characteristics. They could be through bike library models. They could be through dogless, on a small scale. In some cases, they have a limited number of stations. But the important thing is like access to bikes as an essential mode of transportation and as an equitable way of mobility. It is important, and it's a story that has to be replicated in different scales. So a couple more issues looking at the future. Making bike share and biking in general more accessible to people with disabilities it's a big and important issue. There's a lot of thoughts about this, but we still need to see a little bit more implementation around the country. Some bike share programs are partnering with local bike shops to promote more of these adaptive bike share programs, like the case of Mogot in Detroit or Portland. But this is something that, looking forward, we need to be paying more attention to. Another aspect that is important in the developments for the future is the cargo bikes. Cargo bikes are a great mode of transportation that could work for more type of users, including parents and families and deliveries. And it hasn't been explored in a widespread manner in the United States, like in other countries in Europe, for example. And this opportunity where going out and cycling becomes more widespread brings up the opportunity to bring cargo bikes at a more extended level in the United States. And lastly, I want to bring this opportunity to all the planners in California. So the Shared Use Mobility Center is a co-administrator of the Clean Mobility Options, which is a program that is allocating funding for zero-emission mobility programs for underserved communities in California. And funding is going to go to projects conducting needs assessments at the community level, as well as in implementation of clean mobility option projects. So I wanted to invite anybody on the call to take a look at that, especially if you're interested in promoting bike sharing in your local community in California. And with that, I thank you very much, the APA Transportation Planning Division, for coordinating this, and to all our essential workers for keeping us safe and moving. And now I'm going to transfer the webinar to my colleague Paul.
Hi, everyone. I hope you guys can hear me okay. I'm just going to turn on my webcam very quickly, just so you guys know what I look like. Hi, everyone. My name is Po Sun, and I'm a senior transportation planner at Sam Schwartz. We are a transportation planning and engineering consulting firm based in New York City. We are national with 8 offices coast to coast, and we have a team of professionals really across a pretty wide discipline, including transportation, environmental planning, transit, civil engineering, and including community engagement as well. A lot of my work personally is directly or indirectly related to micromobility. And so today I'll be presenting on what is micromobility like in a new normal. Before I start with that, just a big thank you again as well to APA TBD for organizing and hosting this webinar. And as I get started, I will just turn off the webcam during the presentation so you guys can focus on the content there. Just see, okay. Go. All right. So just looking ahead, I want to take a pause again to have a big thank you to all the healthcare workers and essential workers who have been working tirelessly for us every day. We are a fairly resilient species, and we will get past this crisis, but it will also be naive to assume that we will go back to exactly normal as before. COVID-19 will linger around, according to most science communities, and so we really just have to adjust to a quote-unquote new normal. And so what can we expect in this new normal? We are already starting to see streets like this across the country and the world. And even though things like the one from above in New York City is largely a result of shelter-in-place measures, it is still needless to say that COVID-19 has and will change the way people travel. And in the new normal, what can we expect to see? Well, we expect to see, and as Michael and Alvaro has touched on already before, an overall reduction in transit services, and largely due to a negative health perception for mass transit service that will also likely result in lower ridership demand in the short term. However, this is really also an opportunity now for cities to rethink transit service planning. Workers classified as essential during this COVID emergency actually accounted for nearly 36% of total transit commuters in the United States. Service must be maintained to allow for safe spacing on buses and trains. But we also know that this will be increasingly difficult, especially in the new normal, because ridership is expected to stagnate, and transit agencies are going to be strapped for cash. Now, what we see happening here on the right is a snapshot of an actually interactive map published by Gothamist. It's a website that focuses on local city coverage. I want to draw you guys' attention to just a couple of the areas here. If we look at the darker purple dots and just also look at the darker blue highlighted areas, the dark spots are where we see subway ridership having relatively less impact during COVID at those stations. And the darker the blue means a higher concentration of households in poverty. So trends like the ones we're observing in New York City really reveal inequalities that's built into our current transit systems, and that can really affect demographic groups differently when crisis hit. It is really unclear how long agencies can actually maintain service provision in the new normal, but what is clear is that millions of frontline workers still need to get to work in the new normal every day, and transit must continue to operate frequently and reliably to safely get them to the jobs. But what can you do when reliable, safe, and healthy transit service in the new normal is anything but certain? Perhaps micromobility here can hold the key. So what else can we expect to see happen in the new normal? Well, we actually expect to see, as Michael has and Alvaro both pointed out, micromobility demand is expected to increase in the new normal and be sustained. We saw an early uptick during the early phases of COVID-19 pandemic in various cities in the US, like New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, but now it's really a global trend that's been observed all around the world. And if we look at historical precedents, this is really not the first time a public health crisis has had a direct and demonstrable impact on micromobility. When SARS swept through China in 2002, e-bike sales surged as riders looked for alternatives to public transit, a situation very, very similar to today. By 2005, 10 million e-bikes were sold throughout the country in China, compared to just less than 40,000 less than 10 years ago in 1998. And now, more recently, we can also see in South Korea, the only country where Lime actually has maintained operations throughout the crisis. We see that scooter ridership fell significantly during South Korea's initial outbreak. But we also see throughout time, ridership has steadily returned and now sits at just below pre-COVID levels, and that was recorded back in April 3rd. So what does that mean for the city? These two trends right now, in combination with shelter-in-place policies enacted by cities across the country, really present an unprecedented opportunities for cities to reimagine a public realm. A city shut down except for essential service, people around the country have been able to partake in what I would describe as a nationwide, quote-unquote, open streets demonstration project, right? So many of these US cities have recognized this as a good opportunity to test out new street design and be more creative and bold. I mean, these are just a few array of the cities all around the world doing all sorts of different things to try to take advantage and really catalyze on the situation. I just want to quickly highlight here that if we can look at Seattle here, Stay Healthy Streets that was also highlighted before, whether or not these can stay permanent really depends on the city's initiative. And we know that Seattle just earlier this month has announced those 20 miles of closed streets will become permanent. Because what happens if cities don't take proactive actions now in the new normal? Well, the alternative could very much be like this, where we return to the status quo. Cities that depend on transit are particularly at risk for increased traffic in the short and potentially medium term, unless transit systems can really resume safe and high throughput operations quickly. Some research has already shown that possible scenarios for dozens of US cities based on pre-COVID-19 traffic patterns and mode share ratios. In the best case scenario, researchers assume 1 out of 4 transit riders would switch to driving. Just using New York City as another example, and since I'm based here, I'm a little biased to the data, this will actually translate up to 3.76 million traffic hours added to the street grid every single day. Evidence from China has already shown an increase in car sales relative to transit ridership, which unfortunately still remains at around 50% pre-COVID capacity. Tackling climate change is really a global effort and will require major shifts in our travel mode preference if we want to succeed. If cities are truly committed to climate change goals, the new normal presents opportunity for cities to follow through on the policy goals. We have seen from time before that it's very easy to talk the talk, but it's a lot harder to walk the walk, especially when politics comes to play. This is a chance right now for cities to really walk that talk. So why micromobility? Well, we know that micromobility, and as presented previously, has shown significant growth and potential for changing travel preference, although with some mixed results. Right, on the graph to the left from NAPTO, we show a huge, tremendous increase in ridership from 35 million to 84 million in 2018. But then to the chart to the right, we can see that there was a survey conducted in 2019 by SFMTA. They asked respondents, what would you have, how would you have traveled if scooter was not available? The chart on the right really demonstrates that micromobility has as much potential to shift automobile trips as it is also just likely to shift trips away from other sustainable modes. And how has micromobility fared during COVID? Well, COVID-19 has really highlighted two prevailing issues in micromobility: unsustainable business models and a very fragmented regulatory landscape. These two issues really existed before COVID-19, but the virus has definitely exacerbated these problems. The reliance on venture capital is risky and is not a reliable business model for long-term stability. We saw evidence of this already during COVID, where without that reliable long-term funding, a lot of micromobility operators are already scaling back their operations and reducing market size and staffing levels. At the same time, if we look at it from a policy perspective, this micromobility regulatory development has been very fragmented, and this has led to similarly very fragmented response from cities with varying results during COVID-19. Some places like Miami-Dade County have outright banned the use of micromobility out of sanitary concerns. But other places like Detroit, officials actually asked Spin to deploy extra scooters when public bus service was temporarily suspended. Over a very short period of time, we've seen numerous micromobility services suspend their operation in support of physical distancing, but also followed by massive employment layoffs. What we see here is that the scooter startups that survive will have to recalibrate with lower expectations and probably a much more cooperative attitude towards cities in which they operate. Otherwise, they might not stick around at all. What you're seeing here is that every one of those yellow dots are cities where very, very quickly those operators of micromobility have pulled out of their service and suspended it in those cities. Right now, cities will need to consider whether or not they want to support companies that will benefit public outcomes, and also consider how we can incorporate these innovation and flexibility into existing public service. As multimodalism gains widespread acceptance and use, companies that really meet these interest goals will be an important part of the overall landscape of transportation services. So micromobility in a new normal, why should cities care? Well, first of all, micromobility can help cities become more resilient and better prepared for the next crisis. The observed demand during COVID-19 is not only indicative of preference, but also point to micromobility's role as an essential transportation service. They don't rely on electricity and human power, generally requires very minimal space on the right-of-way, and is relatively safe as well compared to other street users. When public transportation is not available, everyone is either walking or driving, right? So if you don't live close to where you work and you don't own a car, you're really left with micromobility options, if there are any at all. We see cities during COVID-19 that have already started thinking about this. Denver, Tampa, San Francisco have all classified e-scooter businesses as essential during the pandemic. Some other cities like Portland actually directly provided financial incentives to keep micromobility services accessible and available. Micromobility can also support and complement the recovery of transit services, if done right. COVID-19 has demonstrated the ability for micromobility to complement transit services by filling in the gaps when services are reduced. In the short term, transit agencies will likely have very limited financial capital and will likely continue to operate with reduced services. There's definitely opportunity in the new normal to seriously think about integrating micromobility as a transportation option that will complement transit use. And thirdly, micromobility demand can actually help guide infrastructure investments, especially now during times of financial uncertainty. In the short term, and in the new normal, we really expect people to continue to avoid public transportation and instead rely either to personal automobiles or other forms of micromobility options. Some of these riders, as we saw from Alvaro's presentation, are actually buying their own private e-scooters and e-bikes, choosing to avoid sharing the same devices entirely. Whether it's privately owned or shared, the current pandemic will reshape the relationships cities have with micromobility. Now is the time to think about how can we provide adequate and safe infrastructure to support and sustain micromobility, whether private or shared, as a viable transportation option. Without these necessary supporting infrastructure, we can really miss that chance to take real steps addressing climate change and also expanding alternative transportation options. And lastly, while micromobility in general just helps cities recover in a more sustainable new normal. there is just very little hope of tackling climate change if we do not seriously reconsider the way we travel and the transportation options available to us. When was the last time planners had this opportunity, and when will really be the next? I really hope we don't take another global pandemic to find out. If cities are not proactive today in their approach towards micromobility, we may very likely see that return to status quo. Data collected from cities that are starting to open back up have already shown an expected increase in traffic volumes and sustained drop in transit ridership. However, over the past several weeks, NASA satellite measurements have also revealed significant reductions in air pollution over nearly every major metropolitan areas in the US. Similar reductions were also observed in other regions of the world. I think people are highly engaged right now, and micromobility has an important role to play in helping cities recover in a new normal. It's a narrow window to implement these progressive policies and shift both decisions, but it's a very narrow one, right? We already know that American cities and cities around the world are already driving more when lockdowns began. If transit ridership returns far more slowly, driving may very well be the established new habits for millions of urban residents over other sustainable modes, and our cities may very well be worse for it. So what can cities actually do? Cities will need to decide whether they want shared micromobility as part of their multimodal transportation systems. If cities see the value in micromobility, they will need to revamp their regulatory programs to make these businesses sustainable for the long term. I'll go over just 5 pretty high-level policy and regulatory recommendations that can help cities better prepare for the micromobility in a new normal, if they choose to, that is. Well, cities can first consider subsidies for micromobility providers that actually support city policies and meet defined performance metrics. Mass transit like subways and buses have subsidies, and these are considered essential transportation services. Why not micromobility? As people become more dependent on micromobility to move around, and we really expect this to be, it will be even more important for city governments to ensure that micromobility continues to be available and is part of an essential transportation alternative. Subsidies really doesn't have to break the bank either. The picture to the right is actually from the Link bike-share system in Dayton. Their transit agency contributes $200,000 annually to the bike-share system. A little help can really make a big difference in our micromobility world. It's also really been 100 years since transportation has been a for-profit business. Why do we all of a sudden think that's going to change? Cities can also explore ways to reduce or redistribute the financial costs for street operators. When we consider the full spectrum of users that share the public right of way, and especially given the way that we're experiencing our near empty streets today, cities have that chance right now to rethink the way the financial burden of the street users are distributed. You can see in this very famous recreation of a photo to really demonstrate that if cars measured by just the space they take up in the right of way and their occupancy, it really demonstrates a disproportionate distribution of that roadway space. The current fee structure for micromobility services providers are disproportionately high relative to the actual road geometry for their vehicles. These fees also fail to consider the actual positive social, economic, and environmental benefits that micromobility can provide. If cities are truly concerned about congestion, perhaps they can think more about progressive policies, such as roadway pricing, or perhaps updating the street designs to include flexible curb management, for example. If we're starting from a blank slate, crafting progressive policies will help enable cities to meet their own city goals. Cities should continue to encourage private-public partnerships, PPPs for short, as a framework to provide that stable and financially viable micromobility service. All the success stories that we've seen so far have come through public-private partnerships where all sides share the risk and the profits. Bike-share programs like Capital Bike-share in DC, DV in Chicago, and City Bike in New York all are operating up through a public-private partnership. Micromobility firms that were used to sort of going in first, asking for forgiveness later, will really be stripped of that financial capitals and the ability to do so. We expect to see more consolidation, as mentioned previously in the previous presentation, that will probably likely lead to more public-private partnerships. In that model, the city has more ability to ensure continuity of operations and ensure that services will be provided to the public, because they've extended their own resources, even if the bottom falls out of the economy. Another way that cities can do is can adopt a dynamic fleet cap system that actually reduces the fees and fleet minimum requirements for services in some equity neighborhoods. Of course, equity requirements is always important to ensure that transportation options are available to everyone. But equity requirements treating scooters are basically like public transit coverage routes that typically do not have high ridership, but actually have quite a bit higher operational cost. However, unlike public transit services, micromobility operators are not receiving any subsidies to provide this kind of service. Oftentimes, these neighborhoods already lack transit services and therefore need micromobility even more so than ever. A way that cities can get around this is maybe instead of imposing a fixed cap on the number of bikes and scooters deployed, implement a dynamic cap, as Alvaro actually mentioned. As long as each scooter or bike is used a certain number of times per day, operators can be permitted to increase fleet size to meet that demand. It allows cities to be more nimble and can reduce the fee and fleet minimum requirements such that operators are not financially overburdened to operate in these particular target neighborhoods. And finally, this is another point that Alvaro has actually expanded quite significantly on, is that cities should really consider adopting mobility as a service to integrate micromobility as part of their whole suite of multimodal transportation ecosystem. In this new normal, we expect again to see continued consolidation in the micromobility market and a greater degree of cooperation between micromobility service providers and city governments. Since micromobility has the potential to complement other modes of transportation, especially transit, aggregating modes into a single platform will provide that convenience and value for the consumers. Users, again, just have a single source to visit for getting from point A to B, essentially a one-stop shop for planning, booking, and paying for the trips. We see some private operators already moving in this direction, but transit agencies with already an established rider base are very well positioned to act as that central hub provider. In order for micromobility to become a long-term viable solution for trips in urban areas, it really must become a seamless part of a city's mobility to service infrastructure. And with that, I conclude my portion of the webinar. Thank you all for your time and listening. I believe we'll now transition to a Q&A session. I believe either Christine or Brian may want to take control of the screen.
Do you have the Q&A slide? Okay, yeah. So just leave that slide up for us during the Q&A. And if everyone wants to go ahead and unmute themselves, and if you are so inclined to show your webcam, feel free to do that as well. And we can start this Q&A. The first question is super kind of umbrella question. If someone could give us a good definition of micromobility. Right?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I'll take a first stab. And my fellow
that was a good first question.
It's a really good first one. So this is actually a recommendation we've been tracking, as I mentioned, in the UK. They're legalizing e-scooters. And one of the things that I feel like we've really learned from the last couple of years is obviously there's just a lot of innovation happening in hardware right now. And so when you think about definitions, calling something a scooter or a bike, it starts to get very nebulous very quickly. And so micromobility became a catch-all term. And I think the one that I've seen mostly is it's based on speed, dimensions, and weight. So a micromobility vehicle is usually less than 1,000 pounds. I've often seen half that, less than 500 pounds, and a top speed, usually 20 miles per hour or less. Obviously, type 3 e-bikes go faster than that. And so they're kind of in this weird in-between zone. But usually from a regulatory standpoint, with that combination, it means you don't need necessarily a driver's license, and it's sort of a whole different set of classifications. And that's really done state by state. But in general, it allows it to function a little more like you think of as a bicycle or a type 1 or even 2 e-bicycle, as opposed to a moped, which has a higher top speed, and certainly bigger vehicles that have more potential to cause injury and death. They fall into a different category.
Okay. Anyone else have any comments to add to that?
I think it's a great answer.
Yeah, very, very comprehensive definition.
Okay, good. All right. Michael, since we have you ready to go, we'll have you answer this next question. How are cities handling the pedestrian scooter conflicts, especially when scooters use sidewalks?
Yeah, this is, I mentioned in my presentation, hot button. I think this is probably the biggest hot button issue around scooters in particular. That sidewalks are sort of seen as a safe haven for pedestrians. And obviously there's implications for people with disabilities who use that and are more vulnerable on the sidewalks. And so there's the studies that I've seen have held up pretty universally. There's some good studies, Portland, Auckland, New Zealand, Wellington, New Zealand, and a couple others have done some studies to show that actually the true conflicts, particularly people actually getting hit by scooters, is really, really low. It's like a tiny fraction of trips and a tiny fraction of collisions and a tiny fraction of injury creating collisions, that it's much more dangerous for the scooter riders to be near cars than it is for pedestrians to be near scooters. That said, the perception is huge, that for pedestrians, they feel like these fast-moving vehicles are close to them. It's kind of an invasion of space. And in this case, perception really is reality, that if you can't walk comfortably down the street, then the sidewalks are no longer a safe place. So what generally we've seen from a lot of cities is that they will, on slower moving streets, particularly streets with bike lanes, they'll say, hey, scooters, you need to be in the street, especially if you have your own dedicated space where they can ride alongside bikes, because that really is about the speed that they ride. They're not allowed on sidewalks, and that's particularly in crowded areas. And then there's sometimes a slight change of rules, particularly for higher speed streets, so streets above 30 miles an hour, sometimes 35 miles an hour, sometimes with lower pedestrian volumes. They'll say that, okay, scooters are allowed on the streets in those locations where there's a lower chance of pedestrian conflict and a much higher chance of a motor vehicle conflict where there could cause a serious injury or death. That said, I think like all the panelists, we've all said, this conflict will go away if proper space is made for this mode. That if we have protected bike lanes, slow streets, that's where the scooters want to be. That's where people want to be if there's a safe place to ride them. They don't want to be on the sidewalks, and the sidewalk riding is really a result of not having a safe place to ride. And anybody who's ridden a bicycle for a number of years knows this is the status quo in the US. And I think a lot of us are hoping that now that more people are experiencing this, we can get some space that's dedicated. And I think it was PBOT who in their micromobility evaluation, their scooter evaluation, said that it's like 95% of scooters use the street on a protected bike lane street. Or it's something very, very high that nobody really uses it. So that's really the answer.
If I may just add to that answer, I think that there's still an area that requires more attention and improvement, and is on the accessibility point of view, how especially for people that are visually impaired, they have been claiming for solutions in which bikes and scooters and other micromobility vehicles could be detectable to them. Usually using some kind of sound or like any kind of way that can be detected, because otherwise they are also users of streets and sidewalks, and they don't have the means to just interact in a safer way with these vehicles. So just keeping that in mind.
I think if I can also just jump in on the last another point, I think unrelated to that, Alvaro, is that I think the parking management of these especially the dockless micromobility scooters and bikes are also another issue that we can also look at, because it's not just about when they're operating, but also when they're in storage, right? And I think a lot of the issues too is just we need to consider really that lowest denominator of the user of that space. So on the sidewalk, it's likely going to be someone with some disability in their movement, right? So we need to consider where these vessels and vehicles are actually being stored and parked at the time. And I think having that dedicated parking spaces proliferate enough throughout the city perhaps is another way to offset the sort of becoming a not so dockless, but also if you have enough parking spaces everywhere dedicated for these micromobility services, then it actually doesn't really impact that use of that system, but also allows visually impaired people or maybe people with disabilities or movements can very easily identify and know where these obstacles could be. Just really formalizing that as part of the street design spectrum.
Yeah, just following up on that, that's a great point by both of you, but with the parking one in particular, Paris deployed just a really high number of hubs for the scooters to go, and it like cleaned up the system almost overnight. It was amazing, the compliance. Again, if you have a space, you're supposed to park it, and it's ubiquitous enough that you don't have to walk an extra 4 blocks out of your way. It's on your block, just like a docked system. People will use those. And so that's another place where cities can really jump in to help support that, is just roll those out in high number. And I think the operators have shown they're willing to help contribute to that, because it does help their operation.
Okay, thank you. So in the age of COVID, how do we make sure that these shared bicycles and scooters remain safe in terms of sanitation? Have you heard of any companies that are, you know, kind of coming through and cleaning them every night, or I don't know, providing hand sanitizer to put over the handlebars? I don't know. There's actually a few questions related to that. So if any of you have comments on that, I would like to hear.
Maybe I can start it off. I mean, I don't know what every micromobility service providers are doing, but I do know that definitely a lot of the major players have stepped up a lot of their sanitation and cleaning services every time they're brought in, or on a per hourly or on a scheduled basis. At the same time, I think there also have been some advancements from the innovation side too. I think they are actually, I read in the news somewhere that they are actually providing sanitizers attached to the scooter themselves, so every rider can just, sanitize their hands before and after using it. So of course, from another, if you want to think of even on a broader, maybe citywide regulatory level, why not actually just provide everyone with sanitizers that if you can personally have that supply? Honestly, why don't, if everyone can bring that with us, we can sanitize our hands before using all these services. I mean, that's kind of what I do right now with City Bike before and after. I still use it from time to time to, for exercise and grocery shopping and such. And I wear gloves and sanitize my hands before and after. So, but that was my thought on that.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I think you're right that there's more frequent cleanings. I've even seen, I thought I saw something where there was like a self deploying sanitizer on one of the scooter companies. I can't remember which one, where it would actually clean itself, which I thought was really interesting. But I think Poe's exactly right. In post-coronavirus, I think the vast majority of people will be walking around with some sort of cleaning thing, particularly if they're going to get on some sort of public transportation, which really shared micromobility is an extension of the public transportation system. So I think that will be much more of a reality. That said, cities usually, that I've seen, as part of their relaunch permits for operators, are asking for a COVID plan. They want to know, hey, what are you doing, so that we can communicate to our constituents. We approve them, and this is what they're going to be doing to address the spread of the virus.
Yeah, I briefly touched on that during my presentation. So bike share programs have been, like the ones in operations, have been disinfecting the bikes. Usually, every time that they come back to the warehouse at the station level, they have deployed their teams, just disinfect the bikes, more regularly than they used to. So in that sense, I think that there is a reasonable effort being done by the bike share companies and operators. And I do think that it's, in terms of cities and how we adapt to the new normal and so on, kind of the ideas of having mobility hubs or areas where there's a concentration of movement or functions in the city. I think that seeing like hand sanitizers, stations there, it's gonna become kind of a normal, as well as, going back to the basics, washing their hands. I mean, providing more options for people to wash their hands.
Yeah.
I mean, like we do it for big events, maybe we need to start thinking not just about the hand sanitizer, but also going back to the very basic soap and water.
Okay, thank you. And one of our attendees typed in that they saw a company who makes handlebars that disinfect themselves in the sun. So Michael, maybe that's what you were thinking of.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, yeah, all right. Okay, so as I'm looking down the list, we have a lot of questions. There are quite a few that are kind of centered around, essentially, my community isn't into micromobility, or they've outright banned micromobility companies. How do we change their attitude to get with the times?
I mean, I'm going to put on my planning hat from when I used to work in the city of San Francisco. It can be quite a process, obviously, to, changing people's minds is not something that's easy to do. That said, the whole point of this webinar is I think we have opened a new window and era that I think kind of the knee-jerk reaction of I don't like those things may not fly anymore. Particularly, I think I haven't seen too much of it yet, but I've heard from some of my city partners, just economic development, jobs, right? We're in a recession, people need jobs, and these operators, if they're willing to put scooters or bike share on the ground, they're providing jobs. And that's very different mindset than we were just a couple months ago. And that's not something that obviously transportation planners tend to harp on, and all of us know that there are many other reasons that we've all touched upon. But in this current moment in time, that might be a very compelling argument to particularly elected officials or people who need to kind of go up against them. And then I think that, again, with coronavirus, there's a sort of proof of concept thing here where, hey, people are using this. We want to keep more cars off the street. If everybody drove, particularly as people aren't taking as much public transportation in this sort of first phase after coronavirus, that can be a compelling argument as well. And then, yeah, I mean, I think you can run with those. And then obviously, I think I talked a little bit, just there's a little bit of opportunity to do kind of data-driven management and some pieces to kind of show that, hey, we understand what's happening on the street in a really good way. We can address problems quickly and nimbly, just like we're doing with these slow streets and other things that cities maybe can show. We have the ability to adapt very quickly. And that's really what I think this phenomenon warrants, is a nimble government who can move its regulations around to respond to what's happening out there.
I do want to emphasize as well, in some cases, like there are different models to put together, for example, bike share programs. I refer to some of these, like there is, of course, the big, systems that require massive investments, but there is also the library, bike model. Like you can just partner with a local non-for-profit, or as I mentioned, bike shops that keep providing service. I mean, they could just refurbish bikes and provide, like you can make a fleet of bikes, ready to go, and just start managing from a grassroots type of service for providing micromobility options for people. So just want to bring up that it's not necessary to have like massive investment of money. There are different models to put together these systems. And the last thing that I wanted to bring up to everybody's attention is like in some states, there are rebates to purchase bikes. So there are some programs down there, that facilitate, getting e-bikes, for example, that could also be put into good use either as a share program or, for individuals.
I just have a couple quick things to tack on to the end. Maybe from, if I put on maybe my, community advocacy hat, I feel like, two things that, first of all, data really speaks a lot, and it's numbers that everyone can get behind. When we look at, pre-COVID level kind of ridership levels and looking at during COVID, I think, cities can see the numbers grow, and there's a very measurable demand that's out there right now. And, like I mentioned before, this is really like an unprecedented opportunity. There's cities all around the country and the world now see the streets like, whoa, overnight. Like, it's just quite different from what they've been seeing for everything that they have known before. So a lot of people are starting to think that, what can we do with all this space, right? And the second part of this is that, well, it's very important to tie in the data to the city's own, to your town, village, city's own policies, because it's important to remind them that, well, if you're interested in serious about climate change goals, there's really no other way to do it than to really shift modes of travel. And if you're not going to be friendly or open to the, possibilities of doing so, then you're actually not meeting your own goals. And I think a lot of cities and large, dense or smaller cities all want to meet their own goals. That's why they have them. I think it's about tying that reality to the goals and be like, hey, by the way, and like Alvaro and Michael both said, there's plenty of ways to go about doing this. It doesn't have to be that expensive. It could be smaller scale. It could be nimble. It could be a variety of different ways. But it's really about getting the city excited as well with the community. If there is like that disconnect between the city and what the community wants.
Okay, thank you. Can we talk a little bit, and the person asking this question, I know who it is, and she lives in Ohio too, so it's absolutely an issue. Winter weather playing a role in micromobility. I mean, last week in Cleveland, we had like 2 inches of snow. So our season for, safely using these types of things are like, boop. So can we talk a little bit about that? And maybe also that kind of plays into communities not jumping on the bandwagon, or even, communities that just, they're very hilly, or, the topography is all over the place, where it might just make it not very feasible to have some of these forms of transportation. Let's talk about that for a few minutes.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quickly. Sorry, Po, did you want to go? Go ahead if you're ready. Oh. I think there's a lot of, implied really across our three presentations, there's a lot of back and forth about what is the right business model. These sort of publicly funded systems with private operators was kind of the going way for a long time, and then it sort of changed with City Bike having sort of a public-private partnership, and then in the last couple of years there's really been this sort of venture-backed private company. There's been a lot of the growth, and I think you could argue that both sides have their strengths and weaknesses, but I think one of the real innovations in the private venture-backed model has been around the hardware innovation. That bike share has sort of been stuck in a pretty similar set of hardware for a number of years. It was sort of this very dock-based system that came out with the public bike share system from Canada, and then sort of Social Bicycle made sort of a small update. But when you think about the number of new vehicles that we've seen on the street in just the last couple of years, it's kind of mind-blowing. Different types of mopeds and scooters and e-bikes and hybrids of the two, and seats and no seats. And I think there's going to be a lot more of that experimentation. And one of the things that I think about is, I think weather protection, being protected from the elements, is definitely one of the nuts to be cracked. That I think these companies are going to be thinking about. Okay, we pull our scooters out on November 1st, and in come the miniaturized single unit golf cart looking things. I can't tell you what it's going to be, but I think that if this really does have the popularity that it seems to have, and we sort of see this shift in how people get around and around car ownership versus using a shared model, and having sort of full accessibility, I think that this will be one of the areas for innovation. And certainly we know e-bikes have a way of just flattening hills that I think your average bike rider would just be like, I would never get on a bike and sweat and do this hill in San Francisco. And then they get on a jump bike and it changes their lives forever. And I think that we're going to see a lot of that same innovation if we can keep this sustainability going. And I think that we can maybe continue that innovation with different business models that allows that innovation to happen while still maybe limiting some of the negative externalities we've seen of having a purely private push around this piece.
I briefly want to second the notion that electric bikes are a big change for any hilly kind of landscape. E-bikes are fantastic to overcome that barrier. Regarding to weather, I think that the answer it's about of practice and just making biking your normal mode of transportation. I mean, just think about it. I mean, people in Denmark, in Netherlands, in Sweden, they bike all year round, all time, for all purposes, and it's cold there. So I think that it's more the exposure to biking. I think that is creating that, gaining the confidence that you can do it, and you can do it in different weather conditions. The documentary that I referred to briefly in my presentation also shows cases of like people, with families, 2-3 kids, in Maine, up north in the United States, like using bikes year round, to do their daily commute. So I think it's possible. It's just it takes preparation. It's not as easy as just jumping in the car, but definitely if you feel comfortable and safe, I think that people will do it.
So I'm gonna kind of call you out for a second before. I know, Brian, you want to make a comment, because there are a couple questions about this, and so Alvaro, I'm gonna make you my my guinea pig here. So as planners, how can we most effectively promote micromobility options as permanent transportation modes, not just recreation? As you just said, just making micromobility a way of life as your kind of first thought. So how do we promote that?
That's a fantastic question, and I think that this is where transportation planners need to embrace community planners. And you need to build a community here. I mean, you need to, again, like partner with the local, for local bike shops to make people feel confident. I mean, like just to give you an anecdotal experience, in Chicago, I used to be a volunteer for the Recyclery Collective, which is an educational bike shop, and there, we teach people to fix their own bikes. So you feel empowered that, like, if something breaks down, you know how to fix it, and then bring people together to learn how to do those things. And the other thing that I would bring for planners as well is the economic development perspective. So, for example, in Italy and other cities in other places in Europe, they have programs for Main Street shops that if you go to their store with your bike, you get a 10%, 15% discount on your order. So in that sense, not only you're just putting the parking facility, that we were talking earlier, about how important it is to designate a parking spot for the micromobility modes, but also which incentives do you get for doing that, and like making it fun, making it attractive, making it like a community and economic development tool. And more people, when you see more people biking, you're gonna want to bike more. That's my short answer.
All right, Brian.
I did have something to throw in on that, actually, and that's one reason that this topic was chosen to do a webinar is because it was sort of the it topic on the National Planning Conference transportation track. There were more sessions submitted about micromobility than anything else, and there's a good nexus to last year's it topic, which we did a webinar on last year, was curbside management. And I would say, because that's something a lot of cities are sort of opening their eyes to, the fact that their curb space, the curb edge and the curb space itself, especially if they're lucky enough to have wide sidewalks, is a quantifiable and extremely valuable resource. And I would say if cities are willing to dedicate a certain amount of that, maybe a good amount of that, to micromobility, to bike share, to bike parking, even to ancillary facilities like pop-up bike repair facilities, dedicate some of that curb and that sidewalk space to that. I think it goes further than just providing more parking spaces. And there's more turnover involved. More people get to use the same square footage on a daily basis. And I think cities small and large should think in those terms as they're evaluating their curb space and their sidewalk space.
Okay.
Yeah.
Guess what? It's closing time already. We must have like 30 or so more questions. So folks, feel free to reach out directly to one of our presenters if you would like to talk more about your particular question. So with that, well, at least the way that I'm looking at it is Alvaro, Michael, Poe, thank you for presenting today. Brian, thank you for coordinating this on behalf of the APA Transportation Planning Division. Everyone, thanks for joining us. This was great. We had almost 700 folks on the line to talk about this, so it obviously is the it topic, and we hope to hear more. So everyone, make sure that you check us out on ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. We are recording the session. We'll have the PDF available there, and make sure you sign up for some of our other sessions. I know Transportation Planning Division, you have a couple more webcasts with us coming down the pipeline, so you can head over to our webcast webpage to register for all of those. Everyone, have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time. Bye-bye.
And thanks to you, Chris, for captaining the ship yet again.
Yeah, thank you.
No
Chris.
worries. It's fun.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.